Hey, Snackers, this is Kareem Iskander.
Hey everyone, Matt DiNapoli here.
Welcome to episode 161 of Snack Minute.
On this episode of Snack Minute, we have Hank who's joining us yet again. He's going to talk to us about a topic that is near and dear to everyone's heart, which is security. He's going to hit some details on how you can understand authentication and authorization and how it can apply to some of your certifications. But before we get into that, Hank, if you wouldn't mind reintroducing yourself, and then let's jump right into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Hank Preston, I'm a principal engineer over in Learning and Certifications, and I am all in on role-based access control and figuring these pieces out. Right? I've been on Snack Minute a bunch of times talking about lots of different topics, from automation and mentorship and a bunch of different pieces. But in a day job, right, one of the things I've had to do is to kind of help our engineering and operations team manage our network. And one of the things I like to know is who did what, when they did it, and were they allowed to do that thing. I think that's really important for every production engineer that's out there, every network that's in place. And that's why it's such a fundamental topic on so many of our certifications. And I'm excited to show how we can kind of leverage some of the tools that we provide from Learning and Certification so that you can kind of dive in no matter whether you're at your CCNA or practicing for CCIE. So
that's great. Hank, before we get into it, I know you have a cool demo as you usually do. Tell our audience, our snackers, a little bit, what is the difference between authentication and authorization? And I feel like sometimes, I don't know, I do this often, is I use them interchangeably, but they're not the same. Mm-hmm. So maybe you can just shed some light on that before we get into what we're actually doing.
Yeah, absolutely, Kareem. And it's one of those things that's really important to know the difference. When it's working, all of these things blur together, right? And they just kind of function.
Right.
But when you're setting them up or you're troubleshooting, right, each of these phases in the AAA services is a different phase. And you can have one A working and another A failing. And if you don't know which A is the problem, it's really hard to troubleshoot it. You called out authentication and authorization. Those are the first two A's, right? So AAA, but there's a third one, and that's accounting. And so let's talk about the difference between each of these A's. So authentication is simply just trying to see who are you, right? So it's a way for an individual to be challenged by a system. We'll assume networking space. So we'll say be challenged by a router to say, who are you? And so how do we do this in the network space? Most often, it's username and password, right? That's how we figure out who somebody is. You provide a username, you prove that you know that you are entitled to that, you put a password in. There are other ways to authenticate. We won't go super deep into these, right? But there's certificates, there's like UB keys and RSA codes, but all of those are just a way for you to prove who you are. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Awesome. Now, once I know who you are, right, just because my router knows, oh, that's Kareem, right? The next question is, what is Kareem allowed to do in this system, right? This is where authorization comes in. And so we verify who you are, all right? We give a username and password, that's Kareem. The next step is, well, what can Kareem do, right? And this is where the role often comes in, because I typically put these together as like AAA and RBAC, role-based access control. And so like, what role does Kareem have? Is Kareem a network administrator, right? Are you allowed to do just about everything? We'll consider it like full read-write access on a device.
That's dangerous.
Yeah, I wouldn't actually do that in my network, Kareem. I might give you the operator status, like read-only access. You can go in and you can run some show commands, see what's out there, things like that.
I don't blame you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's one of those things. It was actually a funny part. So years and years ago, right? It feels like forever ago. I was a systems engineer at Cisco, and then I was a developer advocate at DevNet, right? With you and Matt and the rest of the team. And we played around in labs and demos and all these things. And it was fantastic. And then I switched back to be like an actual engineer operations role on a 24/7, 365 network. And there is a different mindset when you're logging into something that actually like is responsible for delivering services than just a lab piece. And it takes a little time to like retrain yourself and understand what's there. And so it really just comes down to like making sure that you remember that this is not just my demo for Cisco Live. Right? This is something that if I make a mistake, it's going to tear down the entire stuff for everybody taking a CCNA class right now. So it's just a different mindset. And so different roles. So authorization is about, are you an admin? Are you an operator? Or maybe do you belong here at all? Because that's the other interesting thing, is that at the authorization level, we could come through and say, okay, well, that's Kareem. But Kareem has no rights at all, right? I know who he is, right? But this isn't Kareem's router, so he doesn't get any access. And then obviously between full read write and read only, there's all sorts of potential variations, right? You could come in and you're allowed to do this, but not that. But that's authorization, completely separate from authentication. At the authorization level, like under the hood, we don't care what your password is. We just want to know what is Kareem allowed to do. So typically that's what we just pass your username and say, okay, well, what is Kareem allowed to do? And a list of roles come back. At that point, we assume we've already authenticated you. Completely different step. So those are the first two A's. Have we distinguished? Any questions on the difference between authentication and authorization, Kareem or Matt?
Nailed it. Nope. Super clear.
So what's that next piece, right? It's called accounting in AAA services, right? It's been there but you could also say that it's auditing, right? It's your audit log. The accounting, that third A, is keeping track of, well, who did what, when did they did it, when did they do it, right? Just that track. It's the audit log that goes in. So every time something goes in, right, you've logged in. When did they log in? What commands did they run, right? Were they successful? Like that's the third A, the accounting piece. And you can, when you set these up, you actually set them up as three different, each individually. And you'll see it when we get into the demo, right? We configure we configure authentication, we configure authorization, we configure accounting, and then they get tracked kind of separate on that. So those are the three AAAs.
So I presume, Hank, after going through all of this, that you're going to show us where we can start to play with these concepts on authentication, on authorization, on accounting within particular devices, maybe a router or switch or something to that effect. Are you prepared to jump into that?
I am. Yeah, absolutely. And so we're gonna go through on that. So we're gonna jump over here to my lab system that I set up. So let's take a look at it. So there are all sorts of different potential lab environments. I've become and long been a fan of Cisco Modeling Labs, which provides network engineers the ability to build kind of realistic topologies and share them amongst each other. And so I said for this one, and I'm like, all right, I'm going to put together kind of a simple topology that allows us to explore the fundamentals of AAA services using CML. And so what I've got in here is I built out a small little environment. We'll look at it. And so the TACACS server, right, this one here in the middle, this is what's referred to as kind of that authentication server. Now, in this demonstration, we're going to focus on TACACS, but Radius is another protocol that can be used for this communication. It's often important to understand both of them as an engineer, but for device administration, TACACS is pretty common. In a production environment, right, a common TACACS server would be Cisco ICE. We've probably all seen that. Many of the snackers are probably familiar with Cisco ICE. I love Cisco ICE. We use it in our data center. It does a bunch of stuff, but Cisco ICE is really, it's a bit overkill if all you're trying to accomplish is to just practice your router configuration, your network configuration for TACACS. And so what I've done here in this topology is I'm using the Ubuntu VM image that comes with Cisco Modeling Labs. And then I'm installing the open source TAC Plus package from the Linux community. And so this is something that's been out for many, many years. And so it's a really lightweight version of a TACACS server. It's based on the TACACS standard. And so it can receive all of those authentication and authorization and accounting messages and interact with it. And I can do that without having to spin up I think I was looking at it earlier today. It's like 4 or 8 CPUs and like 32 gigs of RAM for like the smallest ICE server. I'm doing this on a little VM in CML with like 1 CPU and 2 gigs of RAM, right? Super, super tiny. And I can just bake it right into the topology. So that's what the TACACS server is here. And then you can see it's connected to the internet because it has to download the code for that TAC Plus from the sources on the internet. And then I've got a router over here. So in this case, I'm using an IOL router image. So Cisco Modeling Labs, as of the most recent version, ships with IOL. Super lightweight, very simple iOS on Linux images. Super, super easy to run. So again, just a couple of 100 megs of RAM and maybe 1 CPU core to kind of spin this up and test it. And then so we can test it and verify. I've got a desktop over here that we can use to actually try to log into the router with our AAA credentials. So that's kind of what I've prepped and set up. Before you guys ask, I've actually taken this topology and I've got it hosted up on the CML community on GitHub in the Cisco DevNet organization. And so any of the snackers, if you want to play with this, you can download this, import it into your own CML 2.7 server, and you can experiment. I even put in here, like if we click on the guide button, I've got a nice little lab guide that you can kind of walk through to do everything. So if you're watching, you want to play around with this later, I've tried to prep it for everybody that they want to jump in on that. All right, still with me, everybody?
Why are we even here, Kareem?
Yeah, should just be Hank telling you what to do right now.
It's the snack minute with Kareem and Matt. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you guys. So let's jump into this a little bit. We'll kind of take a look at it. So I'm going to open up. So I've reset this, so we're back to kind of the defaults at the starting point. Try to get my topology here so we can kind of see what's going on. So over here on the left, this is my TACACS server, and then I've got my router here. And I've got that desktop that we'll jump into in a second. And so right now, what's the pre-setup here is there's no AAA or there's no TACACS setup yet, but I've got the TACACS server is configured. So I'm just going to kind of open up Journal CTL so we can kind of watch the logs as we kind of do some of this configuration, just so we can see that it goes. All right. So here we can see the output. So when we eventually do the configuration, we'll see kind of some of the logs streaming through here. And then on the router side, all right, by default, this router only talks to itself. There's a username and password that's configured on it as like a local account. Look, it's still booting up over here with all of the zero touch stuff. One of the important things with AAA services is it's a good idea to your console, right? The serial port for devices. My recommendation is often don't tie that into TACACS, right? I've got to walk into the data center and plug into it, right? Let that be the back door, like the backup, the emergency services. Mm-hmm. So I'll often go in and kind of configure that console for just local login. And we do this so that we can kind of protect ourselves in case something goes wrong. And so you'll notice here, I'm doing AAA authentication. Remember, there's those 3 A's. So for authentication, for login, I'm going to set up a special one called console, and it's only going to use local username and password. That means it's not going to go ask TACACS. And then I also want to say that for authorization, I want to be able to actually authorize my console access, right? So we're going to say we want to make sure we can authorize it on that. And where am I going to get my authorization from? Authorization exec. So that's like to authorize for like enable mode access. I'm going to call it the same local and then say local. So what I've done is said, okay, I've set up this special group called console that says if I'm using this group for authentication, I'm just going to use my local stuff. And then I go ahead and we're going to apply that to the line con 0, which is the serial port. And then again, 2 different phases, authentication and authorization are different. And so login authentication is console. And authorization is also exec console.
Hank, as you're doing this, real quick question for you. How do I know the different options I have for my authorization?
Oh, sure. It comes down like question mark, like most of the things in the network area, you can kind of see what's there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so I'll do that when I go to configure it for TACACS. I'll use some of the question marks to kind of look at some of those. But what I've done is I've prepared this device that says if I, or more likely when I make a mistake in my TACACS config, right, I don't lock myself out of the device, which is the most important thing as a network engineer is to make sure that you've got a backup plan. Because so many times we might not be in the data center. I might not be able to walk up and do something. And so we do ourselves a little bit of protection on that side. So now that that's done, let's go ahead and start doing the preparation for the actual TACACS server configuration. And so I'm going to start out by saying I'm going to create a new TACACS server. I'm going to give it a name. I generally name it whatever the actual server's name is. So in here, it's called AAA server. And then it needs to know what's the address for the server. We can see the IP address up here in the topology in CML. So I'm going to say it's address IPv4 and then 192.168.0.10. So it's like any network protocol. It's going to talk to it over its IP address. TACACS default port is port 49, so I don't need to change that, so I'll leave it that way. And then we need a way for the router to authenticate itself to the TACACS server, and that's done with what's referred to as like a key or a shared secret. In this lab, the key is just TACACS 123. And so the server's been defined. Now, we never want anything in an actual environment to be a single point of failure. So in a production environment, we'd have like AAA server 1 and AAA server 2, right? A little bit of redundancy. And so we take all of our servers and we group them together. We're going to say AAA group server, and then we can see I've got different types of servers that I can authenticate against. We're focused on TACACS Plus here, but we could do Radius, or you could do LDAP straight to like Active Directory. I will say the most common you'll see for device administration is like TACACS. And then if you're going to tie back to like Active Directory, your ICE server would do that integration rather than going direct. So we're going to do TACACS Plus, and then I'm going to call it AAA TACACS. And so this is the name of this group that we can kind of question. And then we just say which server. Well, we just created a server called, I got to give it name AAA server. All right, so we've now connected those dots together. I defined a server, and then I put it in a group that I'm going to use for my rule sets. All right, I'm going fast because I know it's a snack minute, and I'm already way over my minute, but I want to make sure you guys with me. Any questions?
No, this is pretty straightforward. I mean, I'm amazed by all the commands you've memorized, but otherwise,
I get the sense that Hank has a cheat sheet on his screen somewhere.
Not Hank.
No. So I do, right? I like to cooking show style this a little bit. I do have my notes on one screen. It's the same notes that's the lab guide that's built into the CML topology. So nothing magic in there.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
One of the things that's nice to do so let's say I mistyped the IP address or I mistyped that key, right? What you don't want to do is to go just apply that before you've tested it. And so in iOS, we've got the ability to do a test AAA group, right? So I'm going to test a group. Now I could test a specific group name, or I could say, you know what, just test all of my TACACS hosts. I want to test them all to make sure that they are successfully working. And then how do I test it? Well, I give it a username and password. Up here on the topology file, I wrote down the username and password. So we'll test the admin account. And so I'll say tac admin, and then question mark again, and it says, okay, well, what password? Now this is going to test authentication, right? Username, password, authentication. So that's why it needs the password. So I'll type my password in. Now, if I did it right, we should see a log message hit over here on the TAC server. So you have to tell it there's different kind of code versions, and so we're just going to do legacy, which is the easiest one to use. So it's a test attempting to authentication test. Boom, I got user successfully authenticated, nice. Which is great. And then I can see my log messages coming over here. I see the connection coming from the router. I can see that there was a query for TAC admin, and then it was accepted. Accepted indicates that it was successful. If I put in a bad password, because negative testing is sometimes really important to do as well. So let's say I do bad pass 123 legacy. We should see a failure on this one, right? Yeah. So we see rejected on this one.
And Hank, you've already pre-configured all these accounts, right, in your TACACS server?
It is, yeah. It's built into the topology. So I'll show you where it is in this TAC Plus piece. So it's like any Linux piece. So it's in the etc TACACS TAC Plus config. And so this is just the simple config file for TAC Plus. And so we can see I've got my users here for TAC admin with a password of admin123. I've got an operator user with a password of operator123. And then up here, we can see where the authorization, and we'll see this in a second, kind of come through. My network administrators are set to privilege level 15. That's the admin privilege level on iOS. And then we can see the operator gets privilege level 1. That's the basic operator read-only type of access. And so this is defined here with TAC Plus in this just config file. And this is pre-populated in the CML topology. It like gets all that stuff set up for you, so you don't have to worry about installing or setting up those users if you download the file.
But it's good to know that where that is, so that if we get into an actual production situation, we know how to manage those things.
Yes. Yeah, and I would say, like, and as I mentioned before, in a production environment, you're probably not using TAC Plus. You're using Cisco ICE or some actual production level.
Yeah.
But here in the lab and practicing the skill sets, it's nice to have kind of the open source library options. All right. So I'm going to open my log back up as we go in. All right. So now that we've verified that the communication's in place, let's actually kind of apply it. And so we're going to do those same thing. Remember, there's 3 phases, 3 A's. And so I'm going to set up a new authentication, AAA authentication, log in, and I'm going to say default. Default's nice here. So unless I specify something different, like I did with the console, it's going to use this specific one. And so, Kareem, you asked, like, what are the options? We can see that I can specify a group, which is what we're going to use. I can say, hey, just go ask some TACACS or Radius server. I can say use local. So those are the locally defined username and passwords on the device. There's some Kerberos based options that are there. The most common one for device administration that I've seen is TACACS Plus, with Radius is kind of like the second most common one. And so we're going to do group because I want to point to a specific group, and that's the AAA TACACS. Now I can put another one in there. So let's say my TACACS servers aren't functioning. You want to back up to something else, and this is where I'll put in local. So the idea here is if the router can't talk to the TACACS server, I can still log in with local accounts. Okay, cool. And then we'll do a similar thing here with authorization. So authorization exec default, and then the same thing, group, AAA TACACS local. Now, what we didn't do for console was the accounting side, right? I'm going to do a little bit of copy and paste here just to save myself some fingers in a few seconds. But we want to also do the authentication or the accounting to keep track of what's going on. And so there's 3 different accounting messages that I've put in because they kind of hit different ones. So this first one is accounting when you enter and leave enable mode, privilege mode. And then these other ones say, I also want to keep track of whenever anybody enters and runs a command, both at privilege level 1 or 15. So I want to keep track of every command that's ran. And so I've now kind of told my server I want to keep track of all of those. And I actually had a typo in my guide. I'll have to go fix that. The group name on that one is wrong. So this should be not ICE, it's AAA TACACS. All right, there we go. And so the accounting's all configured. And so now that it's configured, I should be able to log in via SSH to this router and have all of those things kind of get logged and validated here. So I'm going to flip over. So now I flipped over to this desktop guy, right? Because I want to SSH from here. So this would be like my administrative workstation. And we'll say SSH, not SSSH, just SSH. And we want to use one of our actual TACACS accounts. Again, they're up here. So TACadmin and TACopper. We'll do the admin one first. So TACadmin at the IP address for the router. Okay, it's SSH. I accept my key. We can see over here already the router made a connection to the device. So it's like the router reached out, said we want to verify. I'll put in my password. Let's see if I typed it right. I did. Excellent. And so we start to see some of the log messages that come through, and we can see our 2 A's, right? We got our connection up here, and it went in, and we can see, so here was the connection passing through, and then we can see the authorization goes in and some of the output that goes in. So user TACadmin was found. We got an authorization request. It was permitted by line 4. Line 4 would be from that config file we saw. And then we can see some of the outputs that happen. These are all kind of under the hood, but we can see that privilege level 15, right? So my admin privileges. And then we can see the query was accepted. And so all my login was done successfully. Now that I'm logged in, I can start running some commands. So show IP interface brief, right? And I'm trying to generate some accounting stuff so we can see those in the accounting log. And then I'll do a write mem, right? So we can see over here, the connect messages indicate that every time I ran one of those commands, it sent a message off to the server. The accounting log for this server happens to go into a different file, and I've got it listed up here on the thing. And so this is the accounting file, so we can take a look at it. So we can do tail f var log tac plus dot accounting. And in here, I'm going to widen this out a little bit. We can see all of those commands I ran. So we can see the show IP interface brief command that was ran. We can see the write mem command. If I go run another command over here, we'll see it kind of hit this log immediately. So let's say I want to do a show version, right? So every command that's ran, right, gets logged in the accounting. So we've hit all 3 of the A's: authentication, authorization, and accounting.
Nice.
Really important skill. And again, if we go back and we kind of look at the, I grabbed this one, right? All the way from CCNA, understanding kind of the different concepts that are there, the configuration. It's a really critical skill. And being able to really kind of test this and troubleshoot it and lab it out using Cisco Modeling Labs is really kind of, it's a nice feature that you can dive in. You don't need the heavy lifting of ICE kind of loaded up. You can do a lot of this just with what's kind of out of the box in CML.
One thing that comes to mind too, and I know we have to wrap it up here, Matt. Well, first of all, I've seen like managing your all of this on on-prem versus the cloud makes a difference, but the same functionality, I've seen that in Meraki. If you're managing everything in your Meraki dashboard, you can actually go see who was authenticated when and what kind of actions they've taken, and then you can actually set alerts to be sent out based on some of the actions that were taken on your dashboard. The other thing is there a way to take all of the logs that happen on the TACACS server, Hank, and then push that out to like a Splunk instance to be able to do all the auditing in one place?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is absolutely. If we were doing this with TAC Plus, and TAC Plus can be used, and I've used this in a few use cases, these are just log files on a Linux system. Those could be sent to any kind of external log system, so Splunk or anything on that side.
Right.
Cisco ICE, the production one, much more likely to be used, has feeds to send those to all sorts of other places as well. So yeah, absolutely, you could do that.
Cool.
Awesome.
All right. Unfortunately, Hank, that is all the time we have. Thank you for running through all the A's. This was neat for me because I have done this a long time ago, but I forgot that I did it. Yeah. So it's cool to refresh my memory on that. Snackers, check out all this great material that Hank has put together for you guys as you prepare for your various certifications that this is included in. Again, thank you, Hank, for joining us, and we'll see you guys next week.
Yeah, this was definitely an A+ episode. Thank you, Hank. Thank you, Snackers.
AAA. It's a AAA episode.
Yeah.